again. I'm Ellen from Be So Creative, and I'm in the process of putting binding on a quilt. I'm doing it entirely with a machine, and today I'm to the point where I am ready to go ahead and stitch this binding right onto my quilt. Now, the idea of putting a binding on is it's already folded and has a finished edge here, so I'll be sewing along this edge. Once that's sewn, I'll be able to wrap this around, turn it to the back, and I'll have a finished edge on both sides. And then, because I want to do this all on the machine, I want to be able to sew on the top of the quilt and then have it catch that folded over side on the back so that I don't have to do any hand sewing. If you've already made a quilt top, you probably know how to get a pretty good consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. Well, the 1/4 inch seam allowance is a little small for sewing on quilt binding. And I'm going to show you why I think that is. And by the way, I always use a walking foot or a dual feed foot when I'm applying binding. You've got a lot of layers in your quilt. You've got a couple of more layers in your binding. You really need that walking foot or dual feed foot to keep all those layers together and in place. So I'm going to start and just sew a little bit with 1/4 inch, which is my usual seam allowance that I would typically use. I'm sewing to the right side of my quilt. I have my double fold binding on. And let me just show you what happens just a few inches that I've gone there. There's my 1/4 inch seam. And now I'm going to be folding this over, and then it's going to fold all the way over to the back side. And I want you to see that this is going to create quite a narrow binding on top. This is going to make my binding about 3/8 of an inch on top. And then on the back side, my binding's going to be quite thick. It's going to be 1/2 inch on the back side. I feel that I like to have these two a little more balanced. I want this side to be a little bit wider, and I don't want quite so much fabric folded over here at the back. I think it looks a little less professional that way, a little less clean. So if 1/4 inch is a little small, let's see what happens if I go to 3/8 of an inch. Here's my 3/8 inch mark on my machine. So here I hope you can see the difference. There's a 1/4 inch seam, there's a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now if I go to fold this over and wrap it around, I have a much wider binding that's going to show on the front of my quilt. It's almost 1/2 inch now on the front of my quilt. But on the back, I'm going to have a little bit of a problem because I don't have enough to fold over and cover up my stitching line. I'm going to need to have this flap come over about 1/16 of an inch past the stitching line in order to be able to sew it down from the front side. So 3/8 inches is actually too big. Well, 1/4 inch wasn't quite big enough. So there's only one solution. I'm going to have to find something right in between those two. I'm going to have to go into my 1/16 of an inch. So 1/4 inch is 4/16. I'm going to have to go to 5/16. That's getting difficult. You don't have 1/16 inch markings on your machine. I don't either. So I just like to think of it a couple of ways. You can either think of it as a very fat 1/4 inch. Find your 1/4 inch marking and make it a little bit fatter by shifting your fabric a little bit to the right. My favorite way is to find my 1/4 inch mark and then make my needle shift over a couple of notches. And I have a needle shift over here on my machine that I can shift my needle over It just went over about 2 notches past that 1/4 of an inch mark. And I'm going to sew there and see how I like that. So there's the difference. There's that extra 1/16 of an inch that I came in. It's not quite 3/8. It's a little bit bigger than 1/4. Let's see what happens now when I fold this one over. I'm really liking the way it looks on the front. And when I get to the back side, I have enough to cover my seam line there, and it goes beyond the seam line just about a 1/16 of an inch. This is going to make it really easy to come along here, stitch in the ditch, and still catch that folded edge on the back.